I'm here at the Tacoma Chinese Reconciliation Park. This park was created because decades ago there was a lot of abuse of the Chinese people here in Tacoma, because many people in Tacoma, or some people, felt that there were getting to be too many of them, and they began to get attacks on them and were discriminated against and went through a lot of difficulties. Anyway, it was a pretty sad history, and this park helps cover some of that. So I'm going to be covering it as well as I go through the park. As you can see, it's located in a very picturesque part of Tacoma. See the mountains in the distance. It's right along the bay here. And here's a big sign at the beginning that kind of explains everything. This is talking about how they had a forceful expulsion which drove out the Chinese population from Tacoma in 1885. The park is a way to help in healing with this, in the community with this act. And they produce many sculptures and other places along here to understand what happened. The first Chinese immigrants that came here were welcomed because they were willing to work difficult, tedious, and dangerous jobs in the rapidly expanding economy. The first Chinese Americans dug mines, built railroads, planted crops, fished the area's rivers and bays. They were also cooks, laundrymen, barbers, servants, grocers, merchants, and vegetable gardeners. However, as the U.S. gold rush diminished, the economy declined, wages dropped, and jobs became scarce. The once hopeful Chinese who came for opportunity and to send money home to their families became targets of discrimination and disrespect. This talks about Gold Mountain. Basically, Gold Mountain was a reference to America, that if they could save and scrimp and make sacrifices, they could come here and have a chance of striking it rich and making something of themselves. Instead, what happened to some, or many, where they, like it says here, we spent 3 months in quarantine behind barred windows and under guard. Despite protests, we stood naked in line for examination by the white doctor on board ship. We were fumigated with sulfur, and so were our belongings. Inside the packed and filthy pig pen, our belief in Gold Mountain's fairy tales, spun from those who had come before, began to dissipate. And that was Chan Sam from The Concubine's Children by Denise Chong. They created a place here with some stonework, very artistic, shows the looks like the evolution and struggle of the Chinese people. But I also created a bunch of stones here that remind me kind of Stonehenge. Along next to a little garden, and of course train tracks making all the racket. Back in the 1870s, there was a great economic depression, and it depleted the job market. People wanted to blame people for it, so many people blamed the Chinese for their unemployment, and the immigrants from China were made scapegoats because of their race, culture, and willingness to work for lower wages. They became targets of violence, rallies, riots, and local laws that limited their rights. National political pressure only encouraged the intolerance of the Chinese people as Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This was the first U.S. immigration law to single out a specific nationality for discriminatory treatment. Tacoma's own anti-Chinese sentiment boiled over in March of 1884 as the townspeople demanded the city resolve the Chinese problem. They insisted that if economic conditions were to improve, the Chinese must go. On October 3rd, 1885, a committee of 15 was appointed to notify the Chinese that they must leave Tacoma on or before the 1st of November. The committee included Mayor Jacob R. Weisbach, County Judge James Wickersham, Fire Chief Joseph Ralph, and other prominent business and city officials. Frightened by the threats, many Chinese left Tacoma before the deadline, but more than 200 others stayed. On November 3, 1885, an organized mob of armed men led by the mayor of Tacoma forcibly evicted the remaining Chinese from the city. They marched them 8 miles to the Lakeview train station, where the Chinese waited all night in the rain without shelter. The next morning, armed guards loaded them onto trains bound for Portland. Kwok Soo, a Tacoma merchant, later testified, "The parties who notified us to go said if the Chinese did not leave, they were going to cut their throats, kill them, and destroy their property." A little bit of masonry work here that they did. It's a nice little area underneath the bridge there. After all that had happened in Tacoma, there were indictments. The Tacoma Chinese tried to seek justice for their wrongful expulsion in court with help from Chinese merchants in San Francisco. They persuaded a federal prosecutor to issue indictments against 27 men, including Mayor Weisbach, on charges of conspiracy and insurrection. The indictments issued in late 1885 were overturned, reinstated, then overturned again in 1886. At one point, charges were dismissed on the grounds that women illegally served on the grand jury. A new grand jury convened in 1887, but jurors refused to reissue the indictments, and the 27 local men were never held accountable. Tacoma's expulsion of the Chinese people and its ongoing discouragement of resettlement earned the city an inhospitable reputation. Chinese were not seen in the city again until the 1920s. Over here it talks about compensation for losses. When informed of the acts against their countrymen, the Chinese imperial government filed official protests regarding the violence. They urged prosecution of the violators and an indemnity payment to China by the U.S. for the losses suffered. The U.S. Congress, after much debate, finally agreed to pay indemnities to China. The checks were paid to the Chinese government. It is unknown whether any of the afflicted Chinese ever received the benefit of any of the funds. Yeah, my guess is maybe no. This plaque talks about the journey to reconciliation. In 1982, when Dr. David and Mrs. Signey Murdoch moved to Tacoma and learned of the expulsion, they coordinated with the city and state officials, as well as community activists, to initiate a process of reconciliation in hopes of healing the city of Tacoma from this most reprehensible occurrence. Their collaborative efforts evolved into the Chinese Reconciliation Project. CRPF, founded as a nonprofit corporation in 1994, is dedicated to promoting peace, harmony, and understanding in Tacoma's multicultural community and providing a historical memory and healing of the tragic expulsion of the Chinese people from the city of Tacoma in 1885. And here's a nice little bridge they built in the park. Comes down to a nice little place with benches to look out over the water. And here's a closer look. This Chinese pavilion is named Fuzhou Ting. It's a gift from the sister city in Fuzhou, China. It's an authentic and unique art piece crafted in China and constructed here on site. It is a very delicate and fragile structure. Its cultural significance is great, and it's a one-of-a-kind craftsmanship. Cannot be repaired once damaged. It gives warnings about not hanging from the various interior parts of the pavilion or standing on the lions. Thanking people for respecting that and preserving the landmark. Well, I hope you enjoyed our little journey to Tacoma Chinese Reconciliation Park. It was very educational. I didn't know any of these things about Tacoma or what happened with the Chinese. But I hope you learned something today, and I hope you enjoyed our little journey. Once again, this is Adventures with Big A, and I hope to see you again next time. Thanks for being here.